My wife had been working with her close friend for several years. Their office was a modest-sized company, and the two of them shared many stories about the long hours and tedious tasks they had to endure. Despite the challenges, they seemed to have found some kind of rhythm in their work. I'd hear bits and pieces over dinner, how they'd handle difficult clients or cover for each other when one was overwhelmed. It sounded exhausting, but they managed. Meanwhile, my job in IT offered me the flexibility to work from home or head into the office as I pleased. It was a comfortable arrangement, and I had no reason to complain. But things began to change when their company brought in a new manager. This new boss, from what I gathered, had a reputation for being a micromanager. The workload doubled overnight. My wife and her friend started coming home later and looking visibly worn out. At first, I figured it was just the adjustment period of a new regime, something they'd get used to. But as weeks turned into months, the strain only grew. My wife spoke less about her day, which wasn't like her. Usually, she'd vent about something funny or annoying that had happened at work. Now, there was only silence or short answers. It was clear the new management style was taking a toll on her. One evening, she mentioned how meetings had become endless lectures about productivity and efficiency. The deadlines were tighter, and the expectations were set unrealistically high. What made it worse was the boss's complete lack of interest in the actual well-being of his team. Morale in the office plummeted. My wife's friend, who was usually upbeat and encouraging, started talking about leaving altogether. I could see where this was heading, but I chose not to push. I've always believed in handling problems with a clear head, not by making hasty decisions. Things reached a breaking point when my wife came home one night visibly upset. She'd been given an impossible deadline, and when she tried to explain why it couldn't be done, the boss dismissed her concerns outright. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but this time it seemed to cut deeper. She was frustrated, not just with the situation, but with the lack of respect she felt from her superiors. I told her she'd done everything she could and that some people just don't value effort. She nodded, but I could tell she'd already made up her mind about what needed to be done. The next day, she and her friend sat down together during lunch and made a decision. They'd had enough. The two of them agreed it was time to quit. It wasn't an impulsive choice, they'd been talking about this possibility for weeks. They listed the pros and cons, weighed their options, and came to the conclusion that staying wasn't worth their health or sanity. I respected their decision. No job is worth sacrificing your well-being for, and I trusted my wife's judgment. When she told me about it that evening, she seemed more at peace than she had in weeks. She explained how they'd both decided to hand in their resignations together, making a firm stand. I asked if they'd discussed it with anyone at the company, and she said they had. Their boss was surprised, even offering to raise their salaries and improve working conditions. But my wife wasn't interested. She'd lost all faith in the place, and no amount of money was going to change that. Her friend felt the same. It hadn't even been a week since my wife and her friend quit their jobs when her friend landed a new position. It didn't come as a complete surprise, her friend had always been resourceful and quick on her feet. She'd managed to secure a job at a company where she seemed to fit right in, and from what I'd heard, she was already making progress there. My wife, on the other hand, was still in the process of figuring out her next move. She wasn't the type to rush into things without considering her options, and I respected that about her. But it was clear she was feeling the pressure to find something soon. One evening, she brought up a conversation she'd had with her friend. Apparently, the friend had spoken to someone at her new job about helping my wife get a foot in the door. This wasn't going to be a traditional interview, though. My wife explained that her friend's position at the company had been secured through connections, and she'd advanced rapidly in just a week. It was all very informal, almost like the kind of thing you'd see in old business dramas where deals were made over dinner. I listened carefully as she laid out the details. Her friend had suggested that the two of them host a small gathering at our home to meet with a key contact from the company. It sounded unusual to me. I asked why they couldn't just meet at an office or even a neutral location like a cafe. My wife explained that her friend believed these kinds of informal settings were more effective. Apparently, that's how her friend had gotten her own job, and it seemed to work well enough. "This is just how things are done sometimes," she said, clearly trying to convince both me and herself that this was the right approach. I'll admit, I had my reservations. Hosting strangers in our home for something as significant as a job interview felt a bit odd. I brought up the idea of taking them to a nice restaurant instead. It seemed like a more neutral ground and a lot less personal. But my wife quickly dismissed the suggestion. She said her friend was adamant that the setting needed to be relaxed and comfortable. Hosting the meeting at home would give off the impression of hospitality and trust, qualities her friend thought would work in her favor. "All right," I said, finally giving in. "If you think this is the best way to do it, we'll do it your way." She smiled, visibly relieved. I could tell she'd been worried about how I'd react to the idea, and hearing my approval seemed to ease some of that tension. It wasn't an ideal situation from my perspective, but I trusted her judgment enough to go along with it. After all, she knew her friend and the circumstances better than I did. With the decision made, we started discussing how to prepare for the meeting. My wife mentioned that she'd handle most of the arrangements, but she'd need my help with a few things. She wanted everything to be perfect, from the food to the overall atmosphere. It was clear she was taking this very seriously. I agreed to pitch in where needed, though I made it clear that I expected her to take the lead on the details. This was her project, and I wanted her to have ownership of it. The day of the informal meeting arrived, and I made sure everything was prepared to the highest standard. If we were going to host strangers in our home, I wanted to leave a good impression. I went out early that morning to buy the best cuts of meat I could find. The butcher even recommended a particular seasoning blend, which I decided to try. Alongside the meat, I selected fresh vegetables and a few choice ingredients for side dishes. I planned to cook one of my signature recipes, a meal I was confident would impress anyone who tried it. By the time I got back, the kitchen was bustling, and I got straight to work. I took my time with the preparation, ensuring every detail was perfect. The meat was marinated and grilled to perfection, the vegetables were seasoned just right, and even the table was set with care. My wife helped organize the drinks and some lighter appetizers while making sure the house was in order. The atmosphere we created was warm and inviting, exactly what my wife had envisioned. When everything was ready, we stood back and admired the setup. It was a team effort, and I had to admit, it looked great. Around the agreed time, a sleek car pulled up in front of the house. My wife's friend stepped out first, dressed sharply as usual, but not overly formal. Following her was a man I hadn't seen before. He was casually dressed, which I found a bit surprising given the context of the meeting. Still, I reminded myself that this wasn't a traditional interview. We greeted them at the door, exchanging polite handshakes and introductions. The man's demeanor was friendly enough, and my wife's friend seemed comfortable with him. Together, we all headed to the backyard, where the evening's main event would unfold. As we settled in, my wife's friend got straight to the point. She explained that there was a position at her company similar to mine in IT, and given my wife's background, she'd be a strong candidate. The good news was that my wife wouldn't need to wait long, she could start as early as next Monday. However, there was a catch. They wouldn't disclose all the details just yet. "There's one condition," her friend said cryptically. "We'll go over it when the time comes." It was an odd way to present an opportunity, but my wife seemed intrigued and willing to hear more. As dinner progressed, the conversation flowed easily. Everyone seemed to enjoy the food, which I took as a personal win. The man who came with my wife's friend was polite but noticeably observant. At first, I thought he was simply taking in his surroundings. But over time, I noticed he frequently glanced at my wife. It wasn't overly obvious, but it happened enough to catch my attention. I decided to address it directly. Turning to him, I asked, "Is everything all right? You've been looking over a lot." He seemed slightly caught off guard but quickly explained, "Oh, it's the necklace your wife is wearing." My sister has one just like it. It caught my eye. His response was smooth, but I made a mental note to keep an eye on him. As the evening went on, the man's attention didn't waver. At one point, he complimented my wife directly on her choice of accessories, which felt unnecessary. I decided to step in subtly, redirecting the conversation back to the meal and the opportunities her friend had mentioned. My wife seemed unaware of the attention, focusing instead on discussing her potential role. I didn't want to make a scene, but I made sure to keep the conversation balanced and professional. Eventually, dinner wrapped up, and our guest seemed satisfied with how the evening had gone. The man thanked us for our hospitality and left in his car shortly after. My wife's friend stayed behind, saying she'd walk home and use the opportunity to chat with my wife further. They'd clearly planned to go over some additional details about the job. I didn't press for information, I figured my wife would fill me in later. For now, I had other priorities. With the house starting to quiet down, I turned my attention to cleaning up. Hosting always left a mess, and tonight was no different. As my wife and her friend headed out the door, I began clearing the table and tidying up the backyard. It had been a long day, but I couldn't relax until everything was back in order. Despite the oddities of the evening, I was glad things had gone smoothly. Now, all that remained was to see where this new opportunity would lead my wife. When my wife came back home that evening, I made it a point to ask how everything had gone. I was genuinely curious about her impression of the new opportunity and whether it felt like a good fit for her. She seemed upbeat, which I took as a positive sign. "It's good," she said. "I think this might really work out." Her response was reassuring, but I've always believed in digging a little deeper to understand the details. "Are you sure everything suits you?" I asked. "Does it seem like the right place?" She nodded, seeming confident, but I wasn't ready to drop the topic just yet. As the conversation continued, I brought up something that had been on my mind since the dinner. "What about that special condition your friend mentioned? Did they explain what it was?" My wife paused for a moment before replying. "Oh, that. It's really nothing major. They just have a dress code for office attire, strictly formal clothes. Apparently, it's part of the company culture. Everyone dresses sharply to maintain a professional image." Her explanation sounded reasonable enough, but I couldn't help feeling like there might be more to it than she was letting on. I decided to push a little further. "That's it? Just office outfits? Nothing else unusual?" She laughed lightly and assured me that it wasn't a big deal. "Honestly, it's kind of refreshing," she said. "It'll be nice to have a reason to dress up for work every day." While her casual tone helped ease some of my concerns, I still found it odd that they described something as routine as a dress code as a special condition. I decided to let it go for now. If there was more to it, I trusted she'd tell me when the time was right. The conversation shifted as she began talking about her friend's experience at the company. According to my wife, her friend had quickly climbed the ranks by focusing on appearances and presentation. She said it's not about working harder, my wife explained. It's about working smarter. You make it look like you've done something groundbreaking, and people notice you. I couldn't hide my skepticism. "That's how she got promoted in a week?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Seems a bit unconventional." My wife shrugged. "That's just how things work there, I guess." To me, it sounded like a strange way to run a business. In my field, results were everything. You couldn't fake competence when it came to IT solutions, either your work held up, or it didn't. But I kept my thoughts to myself. This wasn't about me or my views. It was about her finding her footing in this new chapter. If this was the way things were done in her potential workplace, then so be it. I just hoped it wouldn't lead to any unnecessary complications down the line. We wrapped up the conversation as she started getting ready for bed. The day had clearly been a long one for her, and I could tell she was eager to wind down. She mentioned that her friend had also given her some tips for standing out in her new role, though she didn't go into much detail. It's all about perception, she said as she folded up her clothes for the next day. I nodded, deciding not to pry further. If she felt prepared, that was what mattered most. Before turning in for the night, she reminded me that tomorrow was a significant day for her. It's my first real step into this new chapter, she said. I need to make a good impression. I assured her that she'd do great. Despite my lingering doubts about the company's methods, I knew she had the determination to succeed in whatever she set her mind to. She was strong-willed, and I admired that about her. I woke up that morning to the faint sound of the front door closing. As I blinked away the grogginess, I caught a glimpse of my wife heading out. She was dressed in a short skirt and a blouse that, while stylish, seemed unusually bold for her. By the time I gathered my thoughts, she was already gone. I figured she had her reasons, though I couldn't help but feel surprised. This wasn't her usual style, and I wondered if it had something to do with making a strong first impression at her new job. The day passed as I worked from home, but the image of her outfit lingered in my mind. When she returned in the evening, I decided to ask her about it directly. "Why were you dressed like that this morning?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She seemed unbothered by the question and explained, "I just wanted to make a good impression. You know how it is, a lot of how people perceive you starts with how you present yourself. It's unfortunate, but appearance matters in this world." I nodded, understanding her reasoning, though I still found it unusual for her. Shifting the conversation, I asked her how her first day had gone. Her face lit up as she began recounting the details. "It went really well," she said. "The boss seems nice, and the team is decent. Everyone's still figuring me out, but I think I'll fit in." She described how the day had started with introductions and a quick orientation before diving into the work. It sounded like a standard first day, filled with new faces and learning the ropes. However, not everything had been perfect. She mentioned one particular colleague who stood out, and not in a good way. "There's this guy who's been at the company forever. He's, well, kind of a buzzkill. He seems to think he knows everything, and he's not shy about letting everyone else know it. Apparently, he's been spreading rumors about my friend, accusing her of sleeping with the boss to get ahead." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but I could sense her frustration. "It's ridiculous," she added. "She's where she is because she worked for it." I couldn't help but shake my head at the absurdity of it all. Office politics were one of the reasons I'd chosen to work in a field where results spoke louder than gossip. "Sounds like you'll have to keep your distance from him," I said. She agreed, mentioning that most of the team seemed friendly enough and that she didn't plan on letting one person ruin her experience. As she continued to share more about her day, I could see that she was genuinely excited about the opportunities ahead. "The work seems interesting," she said. "It's a good mix of challenges and things I'm already comfortable with. I think I'll be able to show what I can do pretty quickly." Her confidence was reassuring, and I was glad to see her feeling positive about the new chapter. Then she mentioned something unexpected. "Oh, by the way," she said, "there's a company event tomorrow night. Kind of a welcome party for the new hires. It's a corporate thing but apparently pretty casual. Everyone's going, so it should be fun." I raised an eyebrow, not entirely convinced that office parties were ever as casual as people claimed. But she seemed genuinely enthusiastic about it, so I didn't voice my doubts. "It'll be a good chance to meet more of the team and get a feel for the company culture," she added. "I'm actually looking forward to it." Her optimism was contagious, and while I still had questions about certain aspects of her new job, I chose to focus on supporting her. For now, she was happy, and that was what mattered. The conversation wound down as we settled in for the evening, her excitement for the next day's event clearly evident. The evening of the corporate event arrived, and my wife left the house looking confident and ready to mingle with her new colleagues. She seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to connect with her team outside the office setting. As for me, I had plans of my own. I'd agreed to meet up with a few friends at one of their places, a casual gathering to catch up and unwind. It was a good chance to clear my head, though the topic of my wife's new job lingered in the back of my mind. Once I arrived at my friend's house, the conversation quickly turned to life updates. Inevitably, I found myself recounting the details of my wife's new position and the peculiarities surrounding it. I shared the rapid promotions her friend had experienced, the informal dinner we'd hosted, and the vague special conditions they'd hinted at. My friends listened intently, their expression shifting between curiosity and skepticism. "That company sounds a bit unusual," one of them remarked. "I've heard of places like that before. They're not always what they seem." Intrigued, I pressed for more details. They explained that while they didn't know much about the specific company, they'd heard rumors about certain departments within similar firms. These departments, they said, were often filled with individuals who contributed little to the actual business but were kept on for reasons that had more to do with networking than productivity. Another friend chimed in, mentioning stories he'd heard from acquaintances. "Apparently, some of these places host endless parties and social events," he said. "It's like a playground for rich kids who don't need to work. They just show up, collect a paycheck, and spend their time networking or doing who knows what." While the description seemed far-fetched, it left me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be some truth to the claims, especially given the oddities I'd already noticed about my wife's new workplace. As the evening wore on, my thoughts kept drifting back to my wife. Curious about how her night was going, I decided to send her a quick message. "How's the party?" I typed, keeping the tone casual. Minutes passed, but there was no response. I shrugged it off, figuring she was busy mingling or didn't hear her phone over the noise. Still, a part of me felt uneasy. My wife usually responded promptly, even during busy moments. An hour later, I tried again. This time, I sent another message, asking if everything was all right. Once again, there was no reply. I told myself not to overthink it. She was probably caught up in the event and would get back to me when she had a moment. But as the clock ticked on, my unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Deciding to put my mind at ease, I gave her a call. The phone rang and rang, but she didn't pick up. I tried again, but the result was the same. My friends noticed my frustration and tried to reassure me. "She's probably fine," one of them said. "These things can get loud. She'll call back when she sees the missed calls." I nodded, though their words did little to quell my concerns. Eventually, I decided it was time to head home. The gathering had lost its appeal, and my focus was entirely on my wife. On the drive back, I kept replaying the evening in my mind, trying to make sense of her silence. By the time I arrived home, I was no closer to an answer. I sat down, phone in hand, waiting for her to respond. But as the night stretched on, her silence remained, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was well past midnight when the front door swung open, and my wife burst into the house with an energy that caught me off guard. Her eyes were bright, and there was a wide grin on her face as she set her bag down. "The team is amazing," she announced enthusiastically. "We had such a great time tonight." I raised an eyebrow, curious about what had her so animated. She kicked off her shoes and began recounting the evening as she moved through the living room, her excitement palpable. "They're all so friendly," she continued. "We played some board games, had a few drinks, and just really bonded. It's like everyone's part of one big family there." I listened carefully, trying to gauge whether her enthusiasm was genuine or just the result of a long night and a few glasses of wine. Either way, she seemed happy, which was a good sign. Still, I had my own questions about her new colleagues and the overall environment at her workplace. Taking the opportunity, I decided to ask about something that had been bothering me since the dinner with her friend. "I've heard rumors about a department in your company where people don't really do much of anything. Is that true?" She paused for a moment, then laughed lightly. "Oh, that's just one of the other teams," she said. "It's mostly filled with people who have connections but don't contribute much." Everyone knows about it, but it doesn't affect the rest of us. I'm definitely not in that group, so you don't have to worry. Her answer was casual, but it did little to ease my lingering doubts. The conversation shifted as she moved on to describing her plans for the rest of the week. Over the next couple of days, things seemed to settle into a routine. However, it wasn't long before she mentioned another corporate event. This time, it wasn't just a casual gathering but something a bit more formal. She didn't give too many details, only that it was meant to encourage team building and collaboration. I raised an eyebrow but didn't press her for more information. A day or two later, she brought up yet another event. This one sounded more like a casual meet-up among colleagues rather than an official company function. I couldn't help but notice how frequently these gatherings seemed to occur. Why are there so many events? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. It wasn't like me to question her social activities, but this level of frequency felt unusual. It's just how the team is, she explained. They're all really active and love organizing things. Most of them were student leaders or activists back in college, so they're used to planning events and keeping busy. It's actually kind of inspiring. Her explanation seemed plausible enough, though it still felt odd to me. In my experience, work events were occasional, not an almost weekly occurrence. But I decided not to push the issue further. If she was enjoying herself and felt it was helping her professionally, that was what mattered. She could see I was still skeptical and added, honestly, it's nice to be part of such an active group. Everyone's so motivated and driven. It's good for morale. Her enthusiasm was hard to argue with, and I could tell she was genuinely enjoying the social aspects of her job. That didn't mean my concerns were gone, but I chose to keep them to myself for the time being. All right, I said finally, conceding to her perspective. If it's working for you and you're happy, then I'm okay with it. She smiled, clearly relieved to have my support. A week later, my wife walked into the house with a spring in her step and a grin that stretched ear to ear. Before I could even ask, she announced, I got a promotion. She was clearly thrilled, and I set down what I was doing to listen. It happened so quickly, she continued. I followed my friend's advice, tweaked a report just a little to make it stand out, and now I've got a new title. Isn't that amazing? Her excitement was contagious, but I couldn't ignore the unease settling in the back of my mind. She went on to share more about her friend's meteoric rise within the company. You know, she's practically a deputy now. Can you believe it? She's moving up so fast, and she thinks I can do the same. My wife's enthusiasm was undeniable, but the pace of these promotions felt off to me. I'd seen how corporate hierarchies worked, and this rapid advancement seemed out of the ordinary. That's impressive, I said cautiously, but are you sure this is sustainable? Moving too quickly can come with risks. She waved off my concerns. Don't worry about it. I know what I'm doing, she said confidently. I'm not going to get carried away. It's just exciting to see things moving in the right direction for once. I wanted to believe her, but something about the situation still didn't sit right with me. My instincts told me that there was more to this company culture than met the eye, but I decided to keep my thoughts to myself for now. Then, as if on cue, she mentioned another corporate event. There's a party tomorrow, she said. The boss will be there too, so it's kind of a big deal. My friend and I are going together. We'll probably talk shop for a bit, but mostly just relax. I raised an eyebrow. Another one? Don't you think these events are happening a little too often? I asked. She brushed off the comment with a laugh. It's just how they do things, she said. You're just not used to this kind of dynamic. Her dismissive tone rubbed me the wrong way, but I let it slide for the moment. Still, I said, it's starting to feel excessive. Are you sure these parties are really about work? She gave me a look that I could only interpret as mildly annoyed. Why are you so skeptical? She asked. You're acting like I'm doing something wrong just because I'm finally getting ahead. Her defensiveness caught me off guard. That's not what I'm saying, I replied evenly. I'm just concerned about how often these events are popping up. It's unusual, that's all. You sound like you're jealous, she said suddenly. The accusation took me by surprise. Jealous? I repeated, incredulous. Of what? You've worked hard for this, and I've supported you every step of the way. I'm just pointing out that this doesn't seem typical. She crossed her arms and gave me a sharp look. You're always questioning me lately. It feels like you're trying to control what I do. Her words stung, but I held my ground. I'm not trying to control you, I said firmly. I just think we should both be cautious. That's all. The tension between us hung in the air, neither of us willing to back down. Eventually, she shook her head, clearly frustrated. I'm going to bed, she said curtly before turning and walking away. I stood there for a moment, replaying the argument in my mind. It wasn't the outcome I'd wanted, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease about everything that was happening. It was late when I heard the sound of the door slamming. My wife stumbled in, clearly drunk, her makeup smeared and hair disheveled. She kicked off her heels and muttered something under her breath, her voice slurring. I got another promotion, she said, almost triumphantly. We're going to be doing so well now. The scene was jarring, and I watched in silence as she tried to steady herself against the wall. There was an edge to her words, a mix of elation and carelessness that made the entire moment feel surreal. As she moved toward the bedroom, something caught my eye. She arrived completely covered in white liquid. Reality hit me like a freight train. The unmistakable nature of what I was seeing left no room for misinterpretation. My stomach tightened, and my mind raced to make sense of the situation. Every suspicion I had about her recent behavior came flooding back. She barely made it to the bed before collapsing face first onto the mattress. Her words trailed off into incoherent mumbling as she slipped into a drunken sleep. I stood there, frozen for a moment, my thoughts spiraling. This wasn't just a bad night or an overindulgent party. This was a betrayal, one I couldn't ignore. I'd always prided myself on facing problems head-on, and this would be no exception. Without hesitation, I reached for her phone, which she'd carelessly left on the nightstand. Unlocking it, I was greeted by a stream of messages that only confirmed my worst fears. There it was in plain text, her conversation with her friend, filled with explicit details about what had happened that night. She bragged about sleeping with her boss, describing it as a necessary step to secure a position. Her friend's replies were equally damning, praising her for playing the game and encouraging her to keep it up. The more I scrolled, the worse it got. There was a separate group chat with her colleagues, where they mocked other employees and shared crude jokes about the dynamics within the company. It was a cesspool of disrespect and vulgarity, a side of her I'd never seen before. Among the messages were even more references to the special conditions she'd mentioned before. It was clear now what those conditions truly entailed. I took screenshots of everything, documenting every incriminating detail. My hands moved with mechanical precision, driven by a mixture of anger and disbelief. I wasn't just preserving evidence, I was creating a record of the truth, one I'd need when the time came to confront her. My mind was made up. There was no salvaging this. Our marriage, built on trust and partnership, was over. With the evidence secured, I turned my attention to the next task. I grabbed a roll of garbage bags and began packing her things. Clothes, shoes, toiletries, anything that was hers went into the bags. Each item felt heavier than the last, not because of the weight, but because of the finality of the act. This wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was one I knew had to be made. There was no coming back from this. By the time I finished, the room felt emptier, both physically and emotionally. Her belongings were piled by the door, ready to be removed from the house, just as she would be when she woke up. I took one last look at the packed bags and the woman lying unconscious on the bed. My resolve didn't waver. This was the end, and I was ready to face whatever came next. As dawn broke, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the damning screenshots on my phone. Sleep hadn't come easily, and I'd spent the night replaying everything in my head. Betrayal was one thing, but what my wife had been involved in went beyond personal hurt. This was a system of corruption, one that needed to be exposed. I knew I couldn't just let it slide. She'd chosen her path, and now it was time for me to take action. I remembered her mentioning a particular coworker, the one she called a dry stick who'd been critical of her friend. From what I gathered, this man had been with the company longer than most and seemed to resent the rapid rise of people like my wife and her friend. If anyone had the motivation and the means to bring down this charade, it was him. I decided he would be my first point of contact. It didn't take long to find his email address. The company directory was publicly accessible, and his profile was easy to locate. I composed a concise yet detailed message, attaching all the evidence I'd gathered. The screenshots, the explicit messages, the group chats, everything that painted a clear picture of what was happening behind the scenes. I made it clear that this wasn't just about personal grievances. This was about exposing a culture of exploitation and corruption that had taken root in their company. Hitting send was surprisingly cathartic. Almost immediately, I received a reply. The man, who introduced himself as Victor, confirmed receipt of my message. His response was measured but carried a tone of quiet determination. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," he wrote. "I've been aware of some irregularities but lacked the evidence to act. This is exactly what's needed to push this up the chain and to the proper authorities." We exchanged a few more emails that morning, outlining the next steps. Victor assured me that he'd use his connections to ensure the information reached the right people within the company's upper management. More importantly, he planned to escalate it to external regulators. It was clear that he'd been waiting for an opportunity like this for a long time, and my evidence had given him the leverage he needed. Still, I wasn't content to leave it at that. This situation called for more than just internal action. I compiled the same evidence and sent it to an external compliance agency. Their job was to investigate corporate misconduct, and I had no doubt that this would grab their attention. My message was straightforward, outlining the key points and attaching the necessary files. I wanted to ensure that this wasn't swept under the rug. Once that was done, I considered the broader implications. There was no telling how deep this went or how many people were involved. I forwarded the evidence to a second agency, one with a reputation for thorough investigations. If there was any chance of this company being held accountable, I wanted to maximize the pressure. The more eyes on the situation, the better. That morning, as sunlight began to filter through the curtains, I quietly moved through the house, gathering any loose cash and valuables. I had a plan to ensure I was prepared for any unexpected scenarios. Some bills from the kitchen drawer, a few emergency savings tucked in the closet, I collected them all and secured them in a hidden spot far from where anyone, including her, would think to look. My movements were deliberate, calculated. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. As I finished securing the last of the money, the sound of her phone buzzing broke the silence. At first, she didn't stir, but the persistent vibration finally roused her. Groggy and disoriented, she reached for the phone. Her eyes focused on the screen, and as she answered, her expression shifted rapidly. I watched from the hallway as her demeanor went from confusion to disbelief, and then to devastation. Her voice cracked as she yelled into the phone, tears streaming down her face. "What do you mean I'm fired?" she cried. "You can't just do that. I've worked so hard for this company." Her words were desperate, almost frantic. The person on the other end must have delivered a harsh reality, as her protests grew louder but ultimately fell flat. The call ended abruptly, leaving her sitting there, staring at the phone with wide, tear-filled eyes. She turned to me, her face a mixture of anger and despair. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You did something, didn't you? You couldn't handle my success, so you sabotaged me." Her accusation was as sharp as it was baseless. I stayed silent for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Then I spoke, my tone steady but firm. "You think this is my fault? Look at yourself. Look at what you've become. Look at you, you are covered in white liquid. Do you want to say that I will confuse this with something, or do you want to say that you did not cheat on me? Her face twisted with rage and humiliation as she glanced down. The realization hit her like a slap, but instead of remorse, she erupted in fury. You did this, she yelled, her voice breaking. You've been against me from the start, always judging, always doubting. You're the reason this is happening. Her words were a torrent of blame, deflecting from the reality of her own actions. I remained composed, refusing to be dragged into her chaotic spiral. No, I said firmly. You did this to yourself. I gave you every chance to be honest, to fix things before they got worse. But you chose this path. You made these decisions. Don't try to pin this on me. My words seemed to cut through her tirade, if only for a moment. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and helplessness, but I didn't waver. My resolve was set. I pointed toward the door, where several garbage bags sat neatly stacked. Your things are outside, I said. This is over. Pack whatever else you need and leave. You're not staying here anymore. She stared at me, her expression a blend of shock and defiance. But I didn't wait for her to argue. You brought this on yourself, I added. Now it's time for you to face the consequences. Her protests continued as she scrambled to gather her thoughts, but I stood my ground. There was no turning back from this. I had made my decision, and it was final. As she stormed past me toward the door, her words blurred into the background. My focus remained clear. This was the end of a chapter, one that needed to be closed for good. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving the house quieter than it had been in a long time. Months after the chaos settled, I found myself sitting across from a lawyer in a clean, quiet office. The divorce process was underway, and I was determined to ensure that my assets and life remained intact. The evidence I'd gathered during the fallout played a significant role in protecting my interests. My lawyer was meticulous, leaving no stone unturned in building a solid case. You're in a strong position, he said confidently. Given everything you've documented, this divorce should proceed without major issues. His reassurance helped, but I knew there was still a long road ahead. In the weeks that followed, the situation with her former company unraveled further. News began circulating that multiple employees had been terminated. The corruption within their ranks had been exposed, and heads were rolling at every level. From what I gathered through mutual acquaintances, her friend was among those let go. The rapid rise that had once seemed so impressive was now revealed to be built on a foundation of deceit and exploitation. Watching it all unfold reinforced my decision to sever ties completely. When the divorce was finalized, it felt like a weight had been lifted. I retained everything that mattered to me in my home, my savings, and most importantly, my peace of mind. The judge's ruling was fair, and I walked away without any lingering obligations to her. It was a clean break, exactly what I needed to rebuild my life. I focused on moving forward, setting new goals for myself, and rediscovering the sense of stability that had been missing for so long. A year passed in relative quiet. I stayed busy with work and hobbies, gradually piecing together a new routine. Life had a rhythm again, one that was free from the drama and betrayal that had once consumed it. I'd heard bits and pieces about her through the grapevine, but I made a point of not dwelling on the past. My focus was on the present and the future, and I had no intention of looking back. Then one evening, out of the blue, my phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. Her voice was shaky, filled with desperation. Please, she began, I need to talk to you. I listened silently as she poured out a torrent of apologies and pleas. She begged me to forgive her, to take her back, and to start over. Her words were frantic, almost incoherent, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of a child crying in the background. The realization hit me like a jolt. She'd likely had a child not long after we parted ways. Perhaps in her anger or carelessness during that tumultuous time, she'd overlooked the consequences of her actions. The crying grew louder, and she tried to quiet the child as she continued pleading. "I've changed," she insisted. "I'll do anything to fix this. Please, just give me a chance." Her desperation was palpable, but it didn't move me. I'd made peace with my decisions and had no intention of reopening old wounds. I took a deep breath and responded calmly but firmly. "That's not my child," I said. "And you're not my wife anymore. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. I've moved on, and so should you." My words were met with silence at first, followed by a muffled sob. I could hear her struggling to find a response, but I'd already made up my mind. There was nothing more to say. Without another word, I ended the call. The weight of the moment lingered briefly before dissipating. I'd closed the door on that chapter of my life long ago, and her call only reaffirmed that it was the right decision. As I set the phone down, I felt no regret, only a sense of clarity. The past was behind me, and I was determined to keep it there.